So LCC is located in Lithuania, and you can see over here a red kind of a dot, a small country named Lithuania. Compared to the neighbors, let's say, we're kind of a small country, but at the same time, Lithuania is very beautiful and unique. It's one of the Baltic countries, and we live near to the Baltic Sea. And again, the size doesn't mean everything. So LCC is also located in Klaipėda, and Klaipėda is the third largest city in Lithuania. We actually also the only port in Lithuania, and Klaipėda is a small city but very cozy at the same time. And LCC is actually located in really nice kind of surroundings. It's around like 50 minutes walk to the city center and around 25 minutes to the seaside. In those pictures, you can see our campus. And as I mentioned before, we are the only North American style university in the heart of Europe with a full campus. So we have 2 residential halls. We have a huge Michelson Centers where you can find the cafeteria, gym, and the huge sports center. And also we have the first centers where the faculty and administration are, where the classes happen as well. So as I mentioned before, we are North American style university, and you can see this from the teaching approach and also the connections that we have in United States and Canada. And majority of our professors, they also come from United States and Canada. We provide a liberal arts education, and that means that we provide a broad-based education for our students. Students who come to study at LCC, they get a depth knowledge in their specific chosen major, but at the same time, they get the knowledge in different fields such as arts, history, communication, international relations. And that allows them to kind of become critical thinkers and engage global citizens and leaders. LCC is international university. We have students coming from various countries. Actually, we have 53 different countries represented at LCC at the moment. And the language of instruction is English. And as I mentioned before, a majority of our professors, they come from other countries. We have professors from United States, Canada, from other European countries, and also from Lithuania. We are a Christian university, so LCC was built on the Christian values, value integrity, diversity, and respect to everyone. We do not require students to be Christians. We actually have lots of students coming with different religion backgrounds. It's just we're trying to share those values that we have and to create this kind of a safe environment for everyone where they can share their beliefs, start talking about their religion. So again, we do not require students to be Christians. We accredited university in European Union and recognized worldwide. So our students, they don't have any problems, let's say, continuing these studies anywhere in the world. And we are a relational university. So we're kind of a small university, but we see this as an advantage. We encourage our students to actually communicate with each other, with the professors. We know each other so well that we know each other's first and last name. We have 6 bachelor degree programs to offer. The first one is International Business Administration for those who are interested in business, finances, and see themselves maybe one day working or having their own businesses. Contemporary Communication for those who are interested in marketing, video production, social media, and journalism, let's say. English Language and Literature, well, the program speaks itself, and English majors, they can work in the translation agencies and teach English because, well, they know and have a really good knowledge of English language. International Relations and Development Program for those who are interested in politics and who see themselves also working in, let's say, non-governmental organizations. Psychology major about human nature and theology, mostly about the Bible studies and prepare students very well for the spiritual leadership. But again, being a liberal arts university allows the students kind of work and look for a different kind of jobs in different fields. We also have 2 master degree programs, MA International Management and MA in TES or teaching English to speakers of other languages. Egle, if you're ready, please begin.
Hello, everyone. Allow me to share your screen. Just a minute. All right. Can everyone see the slides? Okay. Yes. So welcome, everyone, once again. I'm very glad to have such a varied audience, as the topic of international migration is one of those that I am most passionate about, not only because I studied it for my PhD studies, which I completed in United States at the Johns Hopkins University, which might be familiar to you in the context of pandemic, but also for personal reasons. As you can see, I have a double surname, right? Verseckaite, Grzeskowiak. However, in all my official documents, I have to only be Verseckaite because Lithuania does not issue passports with the letter W due to historical problems with the Polish occupation in between the two world wars. Even though my husband's family emigrated to United States way before then, and yet he still gets to suffer for his forefathers' sins. And this is just a tiny little detail that shows just to what extent questions of migration, of people being from different countries, has an effect on our everyday lives. And so it's no wonder that there's a lot of misconception about migration. Migration has been taking place since the beginning of history, but recently it has become especially problematized, especially politicized. And there's a lot of misconceptions there, and that's something that I want to tackle today. So I will talk to you about the patterns of migration. Many people have some interesting ideas there that don't quite match reality. I will talk to you about the causes of migration, what are the main explanations of migration, and what kind of prescriptions, recipes it leads to in terms of managing and controlling migration. And I will talk to you about the consequences of migration, what it actually does and what it doesn't do, because as I'm sure you are all aware, there's a lot of fear and misunderstanding about what happens from migration. So we'll cover these three main parts in today's lecture. Migration matters to migrants, especially more than to anybody else, more to any country, because as you might have heard, the World Bank, a very important organization, has calculated that a person's life chances are more than 50% determined by where they are born. No matter if they are super smart or maybe just of average intellect, whether they are rich or poor, what kind of race they belong to, the country they are born in determines more than half of their life chances. So no wonder that this is called the birth lottery, because just by being born in a more developed country, you have much better chances. So no wonder that people migrate, and no wonder that there's a lot of argument there, because if it's a birth lottery, it's not like you earned the fact that you are born in a specific country. It's not like you deserve to be born in a specific country. It's just a lottery fact of life. And so this is something that helps problematize migration. In Europe, the question of migration has become politicized in the past 10 years, or probably even less. You might have heard of this survey, Eurobarometer, that takes place twice every year, in the spring and in autumn. I personally teach another class, Research Methods, where we talk a lot about how to do surveys, but I'm not going to get into that now. I'm going to tell you that Eurobarometer has been taking place for like several decades. And in 2015 was the first year when immigration ended up at the top of the list of concerns that Europeans think are the biggest issues facing the EU. And this was before the refugee crisis. Before the refugee crisis, it was already identified as the #1 issue. And with the refugee crisis, it jumped up to over 50% of people identifying as the #1 problem. And migration has stayed at the top of the concerns throughout the years in 2017, 2018, 2019. Only now, with the pandemic in 2020, finally migration went down a little bit on this list, but still it's in the top 3. So we obviously see that it has been extremely politicized. One of the reasons why, and this is where we get to the misconceptions, is the fact that most people tend to overestimate the actual number of migrants in their country. If you take a look at this graph, you can see that in very, very many countries, all kinds of continents, all kinds of regions, most people think that there's many more migrants in their country than there actually is. For example, in Russia, about a quarter of population is guessed to be migrants by an average respondent in a survey, when in reality it's only 8%. Or, you know, in Brazil, people think 25% are immigrants, when in reality it's less than 1%. Yeah, and most people in most countries are very, very confused about this. Yeah, why is that the case? This is where I want you to think about it, right? Part of it is that people think migration is larger than ever. Well, in terms of numbers, yes, there are millions of migrants. But if you look at the proportion of the world's population, it's only about 3.5%. And this 2-3% amount of the world's population being migrants has been true for the past 150 years or so. So it's not like migration has really increased proportionately, but it has increased slightly proportionately with just point something percent, but it has certainly increased in terms of millions. And one of the reasons why people think there's more migrants than there actually is because many people would like to migrate, but they cannot. In worldwide surveys where many people in many different countries are asked the same questions, it has been established that about every sixth person would like to migrate, but they just don't have the opportunity because it's not so easy to just pick up and go to another country. You might not have the resources to go, or they might not want to accept you. It's not so simple. So obviously there is a large desire to migrate among people, but still it's only every sixth person. It's not the majority. But many people then kind of equate those numbers. Furthermore, let's not forget how the media focuses on migrants a lot, and especially on the problematic issues. In fact, I will talk to you about that towards the end of the class, what causes these attitudes towards migrants. But I just wanted to point out to you that there's a lot of misconception about the actual numbers. In reality, migration has happened already for hundreds of years. The largest number of migrants has actually, throughout the history of the world, been the Europeans who moved to North America. There's also pretty large numbers of European Russians who moved to colonize Siberia and Central Asian countries. There's a lot of people from Asia who moved to North America, a lot of people who were forcibly moved from Africa to America, to both Americas, and so on. Now, this is something that's important to remember. One of the key reasons why people are confused about migration is because of this extreme focus on the developed countries, extreme focus on the Western countries, extreme focus on the countries of immigration. And they think that, you know, they are the place where there's the most migration. That actually is not true. Migration has been kind of coming in waves. It's always been about the same amount, the same percentage, not numbers, but percentages. But it has been growing or going down with historical events. So obviously the first explosion of this, like the first wave of globalization of migration, this took place at the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, with the explosion of things like steamship travel, where instead of taking 2 months to cross the Atlantic, you could do it in 6 weeks. And you know, that's much faster, right? Many more people were able to do it. In Europe, there was a baby boom with the invention of vaccines. Even now, vaccines are relevant for us, right? History repeats itself. And so a lot of people were able to travel, and this was the main wave. In this case, was from Europe to the Americas. Between the two world wars, there was a slight downturn in the flows of migration because of the Great Depression, the economic downturn. It meant that there's less need for foreign workers, and it also meant that within the countries there was a lot of attempt to find who to blame, who to scapegoat. So many countries instituted protective measures against each other. Many countries at that time had pretty racist, directly racist laws. The United States had the Chinese Exclusion Act. Australia had the so-called White Australia policy, and so on and so forth. And this was maintained for quite a few decades. After the Second World War, we had two main waves of migrants. There were the so-called displaced persons, what we today call refugees and asylum seekers. This was the first time when such a concept was recognized. Mostly it was people who were displaced in Europe by the Second World War, especially people who ran away from the Red Army, which were occupying Eastern European states. Interestingly, at that time, most Western European countries did not want to accept these refugees. So again, history repeats itself. Nobody wants refugees. So in the end, most of those people ended up traveling to live in places like the United States, Canada, and Australia through some sort of distant relatives or former co-nationals who migrated there in the earlier waves. Very soon, Western Europeans regretted this policy because they realized that they need labor force. they need laborers. Second World War killed a lot of people, and most of those people who it killed were young men who were in the army. And so they had to replace these with some other labor force, and they ended up inviting so-called guest workers, the Gastarbeiter, that's the German term. Germany invited a lot of people from Turkey. Dutch people invited people from Indonesia, which was their former colony. France and some other countries, they invited people from North Africa, again, due to colonial relationships. So they had to import that labor from further away regions. If they had kept the displaced persons, maybe they would have needed less. But the fact was that they did end up inviting a lot of these people. They were invited with the idea that they're going to only stay for a few years and leave again, but it didn't work out that way, because once a person has lived for a few years in a foreign country, they often just establish their life there. And taking into account the attention to human rights, the right to family life was established, and so these people were allowed to bring their families, and so they established themselves. And in Germany, we have already several generations of several million Turkish people. So this increased migration through, first of all, labor migrants, and then additionally family migrants that were brought with them. In 1970s, there was an oil crisis, as you might know from learning history, which was caused by the war between Israel and the Gulf states, or the Arab states. And it again brought an economic downturn, which again meant that the demand for migrants, demand for laborers went down, but they were already there. And they already had these expectations of being able to travel and work. And so this is the moment when the supply of migration exceeds the demand for migration. And that's when migration becomes problematized again in politics, and people are starting to be anti-immigrant more directly. With the end of Cold War, migration increased again, because with the fall of the two sides, a lot of smaller countries, which had been kind of frozen in their conflict by choosing either the side of the United States or the side of Soviet Union, they ended up without a big supervisor, so to speak. And so if there was an ethnic conflict there or some sort of civil war, it sprung up again. So there were again waves of refugees at that point. In Europe, the biggest one came from former Yugoslavian countries. Over 1 million people were refugees in the 1990s. But this was an issue in many other parts of the world as well. So a lot of the historical events have affected the movement of migration flow up and down, but the numbers and the percentages, they have not really been that different over time. Another misconception that people have is that it's the poorest people who migrate, and a real migrant is somebody who's really poor and is looking for some better chances. In reality, most of migrants are not the poorest in their societies. They are not the richest in their societies either. It's the people who have moderate resources, so they have enough to be able to afford to migrate, to afford to buy the plane ticket, to afford to be able to live somewhere and look for work during a certain period of time. But they don't have a comfortable enough life to be happy just where they are. And this applies both to people and to countries. The biggest number of immigrants does not come from the poorest countries. It comes from the countries which are so-called middle income countries, like Mexico or China. They are not the poorest countries in the world, but that's where pretty much the largest waves of migrants are coming from. So people have this misconception that true migrants have to be really poor ones, and then when they see a migrant with a cell phone, then they're thinking, oh, it's a fake migrant, a fake refugee or something. But it's very unrealistic to think that way, because you have to have resources to migrate. So taking into account these historical relationships, the economic situation in the countries, the resources that certain countries have, it's no wonder that we have a very mixed bag in the world in terms of the annual net migration rate. This map shows the countries that are in green are the ones that are experiencing the larger immigration. The ones that are in various shades of red or pink are the ones that are experiencing more emigration. More people are leaving than coming in. As you can see, Asia has a huge number of countries that are mostly emigration countries, large parts of Africa, some parts of Latin America, some parts of Europe, including, of course, Eastern Europe and Lithuania more than any other country. So this tells you how different countries have a different perspective. In some countries, immigration is problematized. In some countries, emigration and the loss of the population is problematized. So taking this into account, think now, I'm going to ask questions like rhetorical questions, because this is not quite a live conversation, but I want you to think every time I ask a question, what would be your answer, and then see whether it matches reality. So you can kind of evaluate for yourself, those misconceptions, are they in your head or not? So first of all, who do you think has the most immigrants? The countries or the regions, the continents that receive the most immigrants? Think about it. Who has the most immigrants? Oftentimes, the answer usually is, America. Well, let's not forget America is 3 different countries. Others say maybe Europe, maybe, but actually in reality, it's Asia. In the past several years, Asia has overtaken Europe, and now Asia has 31% of the world's immigrants. And since 2000, in this new millennia, Asia has had the fastest growing immigration rates. The percentage of migrants there has been growing faster than anywhere else. Europe used to be the largest, but now Asia has overtaken it. Europe is in second place. About 30% of the world's immigrants are in Europe, and that comprises about 10% of Europe's population. North America is only in third place. Together with Europe, it does have over 50% of migrants. And in those worldwide surveys where people are asked about their desire to migrate, they often point to America as their dream destination, but obviously it's much harder to access than any other region because it is surrounded by the oceans on both sides. So North America is only in the third place, and all the rest of the world combined, Africa, Latin America, and the little countries in the Pacific Ocean, altogether, they don't even comprise 1/5 of the world's migrants. In terms of countries, this is where you can see that pretty much the same top 10 countries have dominated the top 10 of countries with the biggest numbers of immigrants for the past several decades. And this is where, yes, you can say America has the most migrants. If you say America and mean United States. USA has over 50 million migrants. That is almost 20% of the world's migrant populations, but that's just one country, right? Germany is in second place and has been for a while. Russia and Saudi Arabia have been kind of fighting over the third and fourth place. United Kingdom is up there, United Arab Emirates, France, Canada, Australia, Spain, sometimes Italy, they kind of jostle for this place, but pretty much the same countries that have millions of immigrants. When it comes to countries with a large percentage of immigrants in their population, again, think a little bit, which countries do you think have the largest numbers of immigrants? I can tell you, for example, there is one country which has 100% immigrant population, and that country is the Vatican, or at least they're supposed to have 100% population of immigrants. No birth there. After that, we see a bunch of Gulf state countries, the countries that are around the Persian Gulf, the Arab countries, which have a lot of oil. And so they bring in migrants to do the actual work there, while the native population is a minority then, and the native population lives off of that money that is earned through oil. So in countries like United Arab Emirates or Qatar or Kuwait, there's more than 50%, more than 3/4 of people are immigrants there. In Europe, Switzerland has a lot of immigrants. Australia also has about 1/4 of population immigrants, and so on. As far as countries with a very small percentage of immigrants in their population, this is where it's probably pretty obvious. You have to be a really big country to have a small percentage. So, a country like Turkey, we think there's millions and millions of migrants there, but they still only comprise only a couple percent because the country itself is over 100 millions. So large countries usually have a small percentage, even though the number might be pretty big. So now think again, what answer would you give to the question, where do most immigrants come from? What is the main region of origin of immigrants? And this is where the answer is the same as immigrants, Asia. Asia produces about 41% of the world's immigrants, and a large part of them stay within Asia. Remember, Asia is also the main receiving region. As far as immigration rates are concerned, in terms of the percentage of population that leaves, again, think what would be the main region where you think there would be the worst immigration. If you remember the map that we saw a little while ago, you can kind of guess. The very worst ones are the rates in the small countries of like the Caribbean, Oceania, Latin America, and the fastest growing immigration rates are in Eastern Europe. At least in the past several decades, countries like Lithuania have experienced the worst growing immigration rates. And out of them, of course, there's many high-skilled and many low-skilled people. So here's another question for you. Who do you think emigrate more, high-skilled or low-skilled people? Are there more migrants who are high-skilled or more migrants who are low-skilled. This is where, again, we have to distinguish the number of migrants and the proportion of migrants. In terms of proportion, in absolute majority of countries, out of all educated people living in that country, a larger proportion leaves than out of all non-educated people living in that country. But because in general in the world, educated people are a minority, in the end, the overall numbers of migrants are still larger on the low-skilled side. So about 1/3 of migrants are high-skilled, which means they have at least a bachelor's degree or are international students, and about 2/3 are low-skilled. So many people are confused even in that place. In terms of greatest emigration rates, the percentage of people who leave, the worst situation is in small countries and island states. A little country like Dominica in the Caribbean loses more than 50% of its population. Yeah, and the main reason for that is because people feel that in a small country, there is not much chance for them to do something with themselves, to get a good career, to develop some projects and so on. No, there aren't many prospects in small countries, and so people are kind of depressed, and then they go looking for bigger opportunities in other places. As far as countries are concerned, the countries with the largest numbers of immigrants, again, think please, which country do you think has the most people leaving? The largest number, not percentage, but number. We already talked about the percentages. Well, for a very long time, #1 country was Mexico. Very, very long time. Mexico was in the top 10 at the very top. But for the past several years, it has been overtaken by India. Now India is the #1 producer of immigrants, and Indian immigrants go to places like the United States. They go to places like the Gulf states and the Persian Gulf states to work in the oil fields and construction. And they go to places like the UK, where it's the relationship with a former colonizer. China is in 3rd place. Russia, interestingly, remember it was in the top 10 receiving countries. It's also in the top 10 sending countries, a very interesting relationship. Another country like that, which at the same time has many immigrants and many emigrants, is the UK. So that tells you how the country's history and a certain specific place in the world makes it at the same emigration and immigration country. So taking all this into account, we know that migration flows in the world are in all regions, all kinds of countries. Europe is not the center of the universe. It is not the center of migration. In fact, at this point, migration between developing countries, the poorer countries of the world, is larger than the migration from the poorer countries to the richer ones. In fact, if you take a look at this list of largest migration flows, again, in the past several years, you will see that in that whole list, we don't have even a single country that is within Western Europe, even though they often act like migration is the #1 issue and they are the #1 destination. There are many big flows here between certain countries within the same region, like Mexico and the United States, like Russia and Ukraine, like Kazakhstan and Russia, or China and Hong Kong. And then there are, of course, the flows between the Middle Eastern countries and the countries which bring migrants there, such as Syrians running away to Turkey or Indians going to work in the Gulf states. No Europe. So, in migration, forget Eurocentrism as much as you can. When it comes to the types of migrants, most people, when you ask them which type of migrants is the largest in these developed countries, the ones that categorize the migrants, is it economic migrants who come for work? Is it family migrants who are brought in because their family members are already there? Or is it humanitarian migrants or refugees? So think which answer you would choose. And let me tell you that oftentimes I've heard people say, well, of course it's economic, or of course it's humanitarian. But in reality, in the past many, many years, family migrants actually has been the largest category of people who are allowed to come in legally. Economic migrants would be in the 2nd place, like legal categories of economic migrants. And then refugees are actually a very small part of the world's migrants. And out of all the refugees, a much larger part of them stays in the developing countries instead of coming to the Western states. So you see, there's a lot of misconception there. And a lot of it is based on the Eurocentrism or Western centrism of the people who talk about migration the most. Now let's talk about the reasons for migration. There are 4 main explanations, and I would like to talk briefly about each one of them. and think about how these explanations then suggest what can or cannot be done to control migration. So first explanation is the so-called neoclassical, which is based on the classical understanding of economics, that people make their decisions based on cost-benefit analysis. It says that people think about the wage they're getting at home, their chances of getting a good job at home. They compare that to the wage levels and the employment chances in some foreign country, and then they calculate, is it worth it to migrate or not? And if it's worth it, they migrate. So according to this idea, the poorest people should be the ones who migrate, right? Because they are the ones who feel the biggest difference in terms of their wage chances and their employment chances. And this shows you that the contrasts are pretty big. This map shows the GDP per capita, or the gross domestic product per capita, meaning basically the level of income in a country. And so we have countries where the level of income is above $50,000 per year per person, and we have countries where it's below $1,000 per year per person. So you can imagine what it means. In some countries, you can live 50 times better, economically speaking, than in others. So no wonder that people migrate. According to this theory, you're not going to be able to stop migration unless all the world's economic situation equalizes. As long as there are poorer countries and richer countries, migration is going to keep happening. So this theory leaves us pretty hopeless in the sense of stopping migration. Another theory is called the dual segmented labor market theory, and this says that migration happens because countries need cheap labor. Countries need cheap labor. They need to give the very worst jobs to those who are migrants who are often illegal, who can't really complain to anybody, who are afraid to do anything to get in trouble. And so they are then just accepting of all kinds of abuse. And according to this explanation, then it's very convenient for the bosses to hire these illegal migrants and pay them lower than minimum wages. And they're very, very useful. And thus this recruitment takes place. The countries that have a lot of immigrants are actually recruiting those immigrants, inviting them. That certainly happened, remember, after the Second World War in Western European countries like Germany bringing in millions of Turkish people. It certainly happened in the United States with bringing a lot of Mexican people to work in their agriculture fields and so on. It's happening right now in the Gulf states where they are bringing people from India, Bangladesh, and Philippines to work there. No, so there's a lot of proof of this theory, and it says that we cannot get rid of migrants, we cannot get rid of cheap labor force because the locals simply don't want to be at the bottom of the whole job hierarchy status. They don't want to feel like they are the ones earning the worst wages. They have the ones doing the worst jobs. It's much easier to say, this is an immigrant job, it's beneath me. And so this is what happened now during the lockdown. Remember, United Kingdom last year, there was this big scandal how because of the lockdown, migrants could not come in to like pick strawberries or asparagus or whatever in the fields in the spring. And so the government had to make an exception and bring in those immigrants because locals did not want to do those jobs. They felt like the job is beneath them. So this is why migration happens, because countries want cheap labor. Another explanation of migration, the so-called new economics of migration, which says that it's a mistake to think of migrants as just these economic beings who calculate costs and benefits and then migrate where they're going to get the bigger wage. It says that people take into account not only wages, but they take into account all kinds of social security and welfare state characteristics. And so this map shows to you the countries where there is some sort of governmental health insurance. There are many countries where if you don't have money, you're not going to get doctor's help. And that's just a tiny little example. There's also many countries where you cannot get a loan, you cannot get a mortgage if you want to start a business or buy a house, where you don't have pensions, for example. One of my sisters is married to a person who is, he has French citizenship, but he's originally from Cameroon. And so his parents in Cameroon, when they were working, they were very rich. They had a fancy house with servants and so on. Once they retired, they became very poor because there is no pension, no nothing. And so now the children who live in other countries have to support them. And so taking into account this situation in many countries where there is no social safety net, there is no any kind of security if you get sick, if you get unemployed, if you get old. So migrants travel to other countries to earn money and send it back home. that is called remittances. Remittances is a huge, huge flow of money in the world. And this map shows to you that the countries that are marked in pink are the countries from which migrants send remittances to the countries that are marked in green. The green countries are getting remittance inflows. And this money helps to support the old parents at home who are retired and have nothing to live on. It helps for people to perhaps earn enough and save enough money to come home and build a house, which is one of the main reasons why people migrate according to this idea. So this theory says that the question of migration is based on the feeling of insecurity. And so if we can ensure social services, good quality, governmental healthcare, unemployment insurance, old age pensions, then maybe fewer people will be prompted to migrate. So this explanation is a little bit more optimistic and gives you kind of like a prescription of what to do. The fourth explanation says that migration has been caused by colonialism. I'm sure you remember from your school history lessons about colonialism, so I don't have to rehash that part of history. But this is, I think, a very clear illustration here. This is a map of African colonial railroads and ports. Basically, you can see a very clear pattern how there's perhaps a gold mine or a diamond mine or some sort of precious metals or jewel mine somewhere further from the coast, and then the colonizers built the railroad to carry those natural resources that have been extracted from that place to the port to ship it back into their Western countries. And so the whole infrastructure of those countries is built for this kind of exploitation of natural resources that are there. And what happens then, for example, if you have a mine, that means you had to raise somebody's garden. You know, people were living on subsistence agriculture, living off of whatever they could grow in their own garden, like some of our grandmas probably still kind of do. And with this intrusion of these foreign developers, these people lost their jobs. And there are not enough jobs in that mine to give it to them. And so they have nothing to do. They have nothing to do. They have nothing to live on. They don't have a job. They're kind of free floating. So this penetration of colonialism into developing countries, and these days it's expressed through things like FDI, foreign direct investment, it displaces a lot of locals, ruins the local economy. And so then where are these people going to go? Well, they're going to go to their former colonizer, because the former colonizer changed the education system in that country. It, educated the people there that, for the British colonies, Oxford and Cambridge is the best university in the world. For the French colonies, maybe, Sorbonne is the best university of the world. They know the language, they have the education system where, perhaps their educational certificates match and so on. And so they're going to go to the countries that interfered in them in the first place. So according to this explanation, pretty much the colonizers, the Western countries, they caused migration by themselves. And it's not just the Western countries. If you take a look at Russia and the countries surrounding it, it shows to you where the former Russian Empire's territories were. And so no wonder that people from the Caucasus countries, from Central Asian countries, they migrate to Russia, because this is a former colonial relationship as well. So this says that basically the immigration countries have caused immigration by themselves through this interference in those other regions. So that's the explanations of migration. As you can see, there's not much that can be done to stop migration. So then the question is, should it really be so problematized? In other words, what are the consequences of migration? We know that there are a lot of fears among people. They think that migrants steal your job. They think that they live off of welfare, which, by the way, are contradictory. You understand that, right? You cannot at the same time steal a job and live off welfare. But, whoever said that, people's brain works very smoothly. So is that really true or not? First of all, in terms of wages, migration has a negative effect only on the wages of the very, very poorest paid people, the absolute minimum and below minimum wage. In most Western countries, that has been the problem only for people who have not even finished high school. Absolute majority of people are not like that. And as this graph illustrates, immigration in United Kingdom has actually increased the wages of everybody who earns at least an average wage, and has a very small effect, negative effect on the people with lower wages, but even altogether their wages still has increased due to inflation. So that is a myth that migrants are having a bad effect on the local laborers. When it comes to living off of welfare, well, again, in the United Kingdom, it has been calculated that actually immigrants from places like Poland or Lithuania pay more taxes and use less welfare benefits than the locals. So again, this is a myth. Yes, in some countries, migrants use more welfare than in others, but altogether, it's the natives who are the most expensive users of welfare. In fact, the most expensive person for any country is a newborn baby, because the country has to spend money on educating that baby and giving it healthcare and so on for 18 years or something like that, right? So migrants are actually not a burden on the country's welfare. Usually they are a benefit, especially if we allow migrants who are young and who want to work, instead of saying, no, you're not allowed because you're an economic immigrant. Furthermore, in many countries, immigration countries, the natural birth rate is pretty low. If you look here, you see that the countries that are marked in blue have a birth rate that is below replacement rate, meaning that there are fewer people born than dying, which means that without migration, they are going to shrink and shrink and shrink and not have enough population to even pay the taxes or to take care of their pension years. So this is another reason why immigrants are actually needed. Of course, brain drain is a problem for some countries of emigration. Here you see countries marked in black are the ones that are experiencing major brain drain, a lot of educated people leaving there. Countries that are marked in red have minor brain drain. Some well-educated people leave, but not so many. And countries that are marked in green and in blue are experiencing the benefits of brain gain, not drain, but gain, because this is where those highly educated people come. And those are the countries that experience a lot of benefits from innovation, from synergy between all the different high-skilled people, locals and migrants. So actually they get even more benefits from migration than you would normally think. So taking this into account, why can't we get migration policy right? Well, there is this interesting thing called the impossibility triangle, meaning that there are contradictory forces that kind of pull into different directions. First of all, as we have established, for businesses, immigration is good. They need cheap labor and they need high-skilled innovators. So from this logic, the capitalist logic, there should be open door to economic immigrants who can be useful. From the perspective of liberalism and human rights, we are required to accept humanitarian migrants, refugees. There's worldwide conventions about that. And we are supposed to accept family migrants because family right is above anything else. You know, family comes before government or anything like that. And so these people, you know, humanitarian migrants, family migrants, they also come into these countries without being able to really stop them. But because these countries are democracies, politicians have to pay attention to public opinion if they want to be re-elected. And so they cannot pass proper laws that would make it very clear and easy for economic or humanitarian migrants to go, or family migrants, because then they're going to get voted out of office. People have, in general, very anti-immigrant attitudes. And so in the end, what happens is that countries are kind of pushing these refugees from each other. They are making blocks for people to migrate. And it's no wonder. If you look at this graph, this is a graph that shows that over history, like from the 1930s until 2014, whenever people in the United States were asked, should they admit a specific group of refugees that was asking for asylum, always the majority said no. Always the larger part said we should not accept those refugees, including Jews who were running away from Hitler. If they thought that Jewish people running away from Hitler are not real refugees, then who is? This tells you how people think. They thought, oh no, they are pretending to be refugees, but they're really communists who are going to ruin our country. That tells you about people's thinking. People think that a migrant is only somebody who, a good migrant is only somebody who can fully assimilated, fully integrated, and they have these pretty unrealistic expectations of these immigrants. So what shapes these attitudes? First and foremost, the most important factor is education. And that's why I'm so happy that you guys are getting educated and seeking that education. For highly educated people, for highly skilled people, migrants are not somebody that they're afraid of because migrants are not competition. For high-skilled people, other high-skilled people are not competition, but rather they are colleagues with whom they can develop new ideas, innovate, and create new jobs instead of competing for the same ones. Furthermore, education, especially liberal arts education like what we have in LCC, it makes you more open to diversity, because then you are more able to accept variety, you are more able to accept uncertainty, you have more critical thinking, you are not going to be afraid of somebody just because they look different or speak differently. Furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, media is doing a very bad job in terms of managing migration fears, because media focuses on things that are full of crisis and crime and controversy and so on. And politicians, of course, are the main source of those crime and controversy ideas about migrants. And there's a huge symbiosis between media and politicians. Most of the stuff that's said on media about migration comes from politicians, even though they usually really don't know what they're talking about from the economic perspective. This here little picture that you have is an example how in Netherlands, there was a party, well, it still exists. They made a website where they asked local Dutch people to report bad things that Polish immigrants are doing. And they use this website to kind of promote their ideas that immigrants are bad, that they are, you know, untidy, they are criminals, they are stealing our jobs, and so on and so forth. And so the media emphasizes negativity about migration. In fact, I saw one study done in Lithuania a few years ago that showed a correlation, a relationship between two things. It showed that those people who watched more news, who watch TV more, who watch the news more, they are more afraid of migrants. So it's not about their own personal experiences, it's just because they watch too much TV, which focuses on negative things. And of course, media focuses on problems and not on reasons or solutions. And for when it comes to personal experience, it's the quality of contact with migrants that matters. This is where we again encounter this kind of inverted U-curve. Like, remember I told you about the resources, that it's not the people with the lowest or the highest resources that migrate, but the people with middle situation. The same goes for contact. If you have no contact with migrants, then usually you have no reason to have any kind of fears, except if you watch too much TV. If you have very close personal contact with migrants, you are going to see that they are just normal people like anybody else. And this is certainly what LCC is able to give you. And if you are somewhere in the middle where you maybe encounter migrants just casually passing them on the street or trying to buy something in the market from them and not being able to communicate or something, that's when people start being anti-migrant and they feel uncomfortable because they feel this uncertainty, they feel this foreignness, and nobody likes to feel that they are not quite safe and not everything is clear. People want certainty and they are afraid of uncertainty. And quality of contact, high quality of contact, close contact with people who are from other countries is very useful to dispel a lot of these misconceptions about migrants. And of course, coming to classes like this. So in conclusion, I want to leave a little bit of time for your questions to answer them. So in conclusion, I would like to just reiterate the main points. First of all, many people have misunderstandings about the numbers of migrants, the proportions of migrants from different places. And a very large part of that is because there's a lot of Eurocentrism and Western centrism, people focusing just on themselves, what they see on TV. A lot of other migration flows are never even talked about among the people in the West. And so, for example, they have no idea that there's a huge migration flow and huge problems in South Africa, that there are migration issues very similar to issues in Europe that are in Latin America. A country like Chile is a very anti-immigrant country against people who come from neighboring Latin American countries. Like, how do they even distinguish? It's a question. Well, when I ask them that question, they say it's the language. You can kind of hear it in the accents and so on. These people don't even look that different, and yet they still manage to think about them as immigrants. The same with South Africa and Zimbabwe as immigrants. So there's a lot more to the migration world than we tend to think off the top of our head as Eurocentrists or Western centrists. Second, as far as reasons for migration are concerned, we obviously have a lot of explanations that are mostly based on economics. And they say that as long as people have economic differences, they are going to continue to migrate. And this picture kind of illustrates that. It gives you the contrast between rich people living comfortable lives and poor people trying to migrate in a difficult situation. This here actually is a tiny little Spanish enclave in North Africa, which has all these walls and fences. And as you can see, that doesn't necessarily help when you are desperate for a better life. So if the situation in those other countries would get improved, maybe they would migrate less. But first of all, they're going to migrate more, because remember that hump over middle income countries. So I'm not saying we shouldn't invest in development of countries. I'm just saying we should not think that that's going to stop migration. at least not in the short run, maybe in the long run. And last but not least, as far as consequences of migration are concerned, most people are too afraid of it. In reality, migration is economically beneficial, especially if you allow migrants who actually want to work. But unfortunately, in most countries, those migrants are the most blocked by the policies, and those contradictory policies come from anti-immigrant attitudes in the population, which unfortunately is rather ignorant and is shaped by lack of education, by biased media, and by only casual instead of substantial contact. So if we want people to have a better understanding, that's what we want to focus on. We want to focus on education. We want to focus on telling the truth, sharing the information. And that's why I'm so happy that I was given this opportunity to share some facts with you. And I will be very happy to answer your questions. So if you have them, please go ahead and let me know.
Thank you, Egle, so much for a really interesting lecture. Personally, I really enjoyed it. So many facts, numbers, charts. I hope that our students also enjoyed it. We have times and we have a few questions. Just allow me, I'm gonna read those to you. So Julius is asking, was Germany the first to bring Gastarbeiter into the country? Was there any other country that might have done it sooner?
Well, actually, this was happening in Germany already in the 1800s. Polish people from the border between Germany and Poland were brought into Germany to do some agricultural work and then kicked back to Poland after a few months. So we could say that Germany is the first one that, in terms of doing it at a larger scale. If we talk about the times after the Second World War, America was the first. They were doing this with Mexicans. They were bringing in Mexicans. They had the so-called Bracero program, whereas in Germany, this was more towards the 50s and 60s, because Germany, for the first few years after the Second World War, was, as you know, a place of ruin. And they didn't really have their own policy or anything like that until the separate West Germany and East Germany got established. So in that sense, Germany was not the first recently, but it was the first originally, and it was the major one after the Second World War. And that's why even the term Gastarbeiter is taken from the German speak, even though it was done in France, it was done in the Netherlands, and so on.
Okay, thank you, Julius, for the question. He also has another question for you, Egle. Which country is the most popular for Lithuanians to migrate to?
So far, if we take cumulatively, of course, it's going to be the United Kingdom. And this is where, another one of those explanations of migration can be brought in. And that's the one that says that social networks, relationships, connections are actually very important in migration. If the original cause of migration could be economic, but then once somebody from your family, from your village, from your relatives or acquaintances or friends has established themselves in a foreign country, they are then more likely to help you to migrate there as well. And so from the very beginning, for Eastern Europeans after the fall of Soviet Union, the United Kingdom was the #1 draw because more people spoke English than other languages, so it was easier to go there. And once you have somebody living there, then it's easier for you to go there and join them as well. Among my own classmates, I came from a small town in Lithuania. I had 15 classmates. Out of them, at least 3 went to United Kingdom. Some earned enough money to come back home and start a business. Somebody else stayed abroad and is living there and is married there and has children and so on. But they went through connections and acquaintances. Then, of course, we have a pretty large community in Ireland as well, because there it's also a more possible language situation. But then once we started getting people into Norway, Sweden, Germany, more people are there, more people are able to come. So these social networks, they work to build up these communities. And so it is possible that with Brexit, United Kingdom is not going to be in the first place anymore, but so far we still have the largest community there of these recent migrants. Otherwise, of course, United States has a very, very big community from longer times ago, from that first globalization wave 100 years ago, from the post-World War II globalization wave. But the more recent migrants, of course, UK is #1.
Okay. And the last question then, because I see that we still have a few minutes. So the last question from Derena: if economics is the main reason of migration, Why is the family type of migrants the largest type?
That's it's a good question. You are kind of noticing this is where I was talking about those contradictions in migration policy, how the reality and the legality and the official paperwork and official speeches don't quite match. What happens with these migration categories is that people choose to migrate in whatever way it is possible. And so if migration of economic reasons is the most forbidden in most of those countries, you usually have to prove that you already have a job, you are often not allowed to bring your family with the economic visas and so on and so forth. People look for other ways to come. And so if somebody is already there, they bring in their family member through the family visa. But maybe that family member would not have come if they didn't want to work in that country in the first place. They just use the family visa as a way to get in legally. As an example, how important these legal categories are, we can take again the example of United Kingdom. At a certain point in like the 90s, 2000s, there was a crackdown there on asylum seekers because they thought too many people are seeking asylum, too many people are claiming refugee status. We are going to become much stricter about it. So what happened the next year after they did this is that the numbers of applications for international students exploded. A lot of those people who had first applied as refugees now decided to apply as international students because they just found a different way to try to come into that country. So those legal categories of family are most popular because they are the most possible. They are the easiest through which to get in because you cannot deny people this human right of having a family. You cannot deny them family life. And so these countries have set up the systems so that they are allowed to come that way, and that's the category they use. If they were allowed to just travel economically, of course, many more people would choose that option, but it is simply not available to them. So this is where you see how the policy that the government establishes shapes migration flows, shapes the patterns of migration to a certain degree, but it doesn't stop that migration. It simply changes the categories.
Mm-hmm. There you go. Okay, well, thank you so much, Egle, for all the answers and for the amazing lecture, for sharing your expertise and insights with us.